If I were to ask you who is the most unique figure in all of human history, what would you say? Well, I'm going to show you that it's going to be really hard to beat this guy.
Welcome.
So here we are, another Easter, and it's all centered around this person, Jesus Christ. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at who is this guy? Who is Jesus Christ? How do we know about him? And why does the majority of the world worship him? I mean, how do we really know that this isn't just some made up thing? How do we know that this guy was even a real guy in history? I mean, this could have been made up and just passed down through the generations like any kind of lie. Don't tell me just to believe it. I need the facts. What are the facts? This is not a faith issue, it's a fact issue. Historical fact. Scientific fact. The evidence is overwhelming, and we're going to look at that. So everything we know about Jesus was written over a period of about 3 years of his life, from roughly when he was 30 years old until he was killed at 33. There was one incident when he was born and one incident when he was roughly around 12 years old. Other than that, everything we know about this guy is only over a period of about 3 years. The first thing I want to point out is, what year is it? AD, which means Anno Domini. In Latin, that means year of our Lord. Now, I want you to think about real carefully, when is the last time we have based our entire timeline on the birth of one man? Go ahead, think about it. So back in history, they thought this guy was really important, obviously. And we only know about 3 years of his life, but way back around the time that he was living, a lot more people knew. And they wrote down what they saw. Eyewitnesses. A very weighty thing in a court of law are eyewitnesses. So eyewitness accounts sometimes aren't the best thing unless you have a lot of people saying the same thing. If you don't believe it when you've got many different people saying the same thing, if you don't believe that, then you're probably going to be wrong. And I know what you may be thinking right now. Well, they didn't say the same thing. Well, it's another video to go into. They actually always are saying the same thing, but I'm going to deal with the larger things. The larger things that all of the Gospels have in common. And what are the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first 4 books in the New Testament. The New Testament is made up of many books. First 4 books are considered the Gospel. But these are all eyewitnesses. All of these books are eyewitnesses in one form or another. It's not the telephone game. It's not hearsay. It's not secondhand. It's either eyewitnesses or people that interviewed eyewitnesses. Incidentally, there is an overwhelming amount of old manuscripts dating back to the 2nd century. Most of the 1st century stuff were written on things that just didn't survive history. And the reason, most people don't know this, the reason there are scripture and verse, for instance, Mark 1:7, the reason they did that is to number the words so that when the monks were copying these manuscripts, they were making sure that they weren't making any mistakes. So they would count the words in between the numbers, and that's how they knew that they were copying the text correctly. It's just an overwhelming amount of evidence, an overwhelming amount of manuscripts. Each of these were written at different times, different authors. Each of them are essentially saying the same thing. So, did you know that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written by people that either were actually with Jesus or people that interviewed people that were actually with Jesus. So eyewitness accounts. John was actually with Jesus. Yes, that is the disciple John. That is not Mary Magdalene, as many people think. That is John. He was a very young man, and that's how they drew young men back in Da Vinci's day. This is Leonardo da Vinci's famous Last Supper painting. John was actually with Jesus, saw it himself, wrote it down himself. Matthew was actually with Jesus, saw everything himself, wrote it down. Mark is believed to have dictating for Peter, saw it himself, saw everything himself, wrote it down. And then Luke, the only non-Jewish writer in the Bible, he actually says we were eyewitnesses, or not we, but they, all the people that are interviewed. He interviewed a lot of people to make sure that everything came through, was consistent with what everybody else was saying, and then like a historian wrote it all down. Let's read this together. Many, notice the word many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. That means that many have told of all the things that were going on right in front of everybody's eyeballs, just as they were handed down to us by those whom from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Who's the Word? Jesus was always referred to as the Word. God is the Word, Jesus is the Word. The two are one in the minds of Christians according to the Bible. The two are one. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Muhammad, the prophet that started Islam, that wrote down the Quran. As a matter of fact, the book of Luke is considered inspired by God by the prophet Muhammad. And they call the book of Luke Injil. They change all the names of God to Allah, and Jesus is called Isa, which is, Allah is Arabic for God, and Isa is Arabic for Yeshua. Yeshua is Hebrew pronunciation for the word Jesus. This relief of Jesus right here is actually in Istanbul. It was in a mosque that was claimed by the Muslims, and they had it for hundreds of years. They didn't take it down, they plastered over it because, according to Muhammad, Jesus is a prophet. Jesus is a prophet, and the book of Luke was inspired by God. Now, this is going to be another video, but I find that incredibly interesting because Luke wasn't even Arab. He wasn't Jewish, and he was one of the writers of the gospel, but somehow that was the one that Muhammad picked. It's very interesting, but we'll cover that in another video. So what were all these guys saying Jesus was doing? Well, he said he performed a lot of miracles. More miracles than anyone in the history of mankind ever, by far. And greater miracles, far greater miracles than anyone else in history, by far. He healed blind people. He fed the masses when they went to see him out in the wilderness. The fact that people had to go see him out in the wilderness is another evidence that he wasn't just a philosopher, that he was actually performing these miracles. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so popular. He couldn't even enter into towns. This man was so popular, and it wasn't from his fine-sounding philosophies. They had to go see Jesus in the wilderness because so many people were constantly thronging after him. He couldn't even enter into towns. He was so popular. And when he did enter into a town, it was a mob scene. It wasn't so much what he was saying. They wanted to see a miracle. They wanted to get healed. They wanted to get fed. Nobody in the world, nobody in the history of the world has ever done anything like this. He fed estimated to be 10,000 men, women, and children with 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. Come on, folks. We've never seen anything like this ever in all of human history. But the fact that Jesus performed all these miracles is not the proof of his divinity. The proof of his divinity is him calling that he was going to go to Jerusalem, get killed, and then raised from the dead 3 days later. That's why we celebrate Easter, folks. It was around this time, about 2,000, little over 2,000 years ago, where Jesus was put up on the cross, crucified, died, and rose again 3 days later. And what is the evidence that we have of that? Again, hundreds of eyewitnesses that saw him raised to life again. He appeared to them. He appeared to hundreds of people, not just the disciples. Hundreds of people. Most people don't realize that. It actually says it in the Bible. Hundreds of people he appeared to. And don't think he didn't die on that cross, folks. The reason why he was crucified is because they wanted him dead. Romans never let anybody go. If you went up on that cross, you were going to die. And they broke the legs of the criminals that were crucified next to him. And to make sure Jesus was dead, they didn't break Jesus' legs. Instead, he was already dead. But they made sure he was dead by sticking a lance up into his heart. And that's part of the proof that he was dead, because what came out first was water and then blood. And any doctor will tell you this, that when someone dies, the pericardium, which is on the outside of the heart, fills up with water. So when a lance goes up into the heart, it goes through the water first, then into the heart, and then the blood comes out. So that is medical evidence that he was dead. The final evidence that all of this is true is the fact that every single one of the writers of the Gospels died a horrible death, except for John. They boiled him in oil, tried to kill him, but he survived somehow, and then he lived the rest of his life on an island. Now I want to ask everybody this. Would you die for something that you knew was a lie? Not only did these people die, they died gruesome deaths. Matthew was skinned alive. Peter was crucified upside down. John was boiled in oil, as I mentioned before. Luke was hung from an olive tree. They put a rope around Mark's neck and drug him through the streets until he was dead. Paul was beheaded. All these guys, all they had to do was say that what they wrote wasn't true, what they were preaching wasn't true, what they were telling other people, what they saw with their own eyes, and the things that they were witnessing, all they had to do is say that it wasn't true, and then the Romans wouldn't have killed them. But they knew that they couldn't deny God because they knew it was the truth. And so they watched their families get fed to the lions and burned at the stake, burned alive in the Colosseum. They watched their families get eaten by lions and burned alive in the Colosseum. They watched their children, their wives, their friends, and themselves get murdered because of what they were saying. If it wasn't the truth, folks, they wouldn't have done it. So there are all these evidences and more that Jesus walked the earth 2,000 years ago. He did all the miracles. He came back from the dead. We have thousands of years of witnesses, and if we were to talk about it all, we wouldn't have enough time. So keeping it short, this is a really brief presentation of the facts. And now you know.